written for publication. I wrote those stories for my kids. Right after I retired from Channel 2, I decided I had spent all those years writing other people's stories, and I wanted to write my own for them so that they could understand. Because my mother never would talk about her upbringing, and I knew a couple of very interesting incidents, like being taken to the volcano and being, when she was a child, by her grandmother and being dedicated to Pele. I mean, a lot of really great stuff. She would never talk about it. So I decided that I would reveal all to my kids. So I wrote those stories for them and I gave them to them as my present to them on my 70th birthday. That was almost 20 years ago. So I'm going to be 90 in October. So that was the story. And I printed them out, and I printed pictures from the family albums, and I gave them 3-leaf binder, a 3 whatever ring binder things, my stories, all the stories. And that was it. And they've sat there for 20 years. Well, what happens in March of 2019, and I have all kinds of time and wondering what I'm going to do with my spare time, because I don't do well being idle. I was as candid as and open and honest as I could possibly be. So, and then last year, I decided that, I'm so old. These little details that I probably wouldn't have written if I were writing a book to be published. I'm so old. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. I don't care. So what? And so there's a lot of stuff in there that would never have gotten in there if I had written a book for publication.
The Munchkin Diary, My Personal Yellow Brick Road, was written by Betty Ann Bruno, who is with us today to talk a bit about it. The Munchkin Diary gives you a clue where her connection with Oz comes in to be a part of today's program. Betty Ann, why don't you tell us, for starters, because Oz fans will be curious to know, how you came to be a Munchkin in the MGM film?
Oh, that's a wonderful childhood story. When I was a very young girl, we lived in Hollywood. And as a lot of girls in Hollywood in those days, this was in the 30s, I took singing and dancing lessons, and the studios, major dance studios, all had bulletin boards that had auditions, posted the auditions at the major studios for parts for children. And my mother saw the audition notice at the dance studio and took me to the audition, and I made the cut. The requirement was you had to be a little girl, not over 4.5 feet tall, who could sing and dance and act terrified. We practiced as 12 little girls. And we thought that's all the children who would be in the movie. And we were 2 weeks singing and dancing in a practice studio by ourselves. And then we were taken to the sound stage and saw the other Munchkins. And when I walked into that stage, that was another world. I mean, it was so gorgeous and beautiful, as you know, the set. But the thing that just bowled me over was seeing 124 adults who were as short as I was. And some of them were shorter than I was. And I could not believe that, because I had always been the shortest person in the class. So what I used to do, go ahead.
I was, how old were you at this time?
I had just turned 7. My birthday's in October, and the Munchkin scene was filmed during November of 1938. My little delight on the set was to sidle up to one of the midgets, and they did call themselves midgets. The term little people came along much later, and they never picked it up. When I was with them at Oz festivals and stuff, they called each other, they referred to themselves as the midgets. So that's the word I'm going to use, even though for some people it might not be politically correct today. But I would sidle up to one of the midgets and level my head against theirs and see, aha, see, I'm taller than that person is, and that person's an adult. That to me was just delightful.
Would you have maybe a favorite story to share with our audience?
One of my favorite things was my mother always packed lunch for us. She was at the studio with me every single day. And we would go to lunch at the next sound stage, which was where the Flying Monkeys practiced. And to sit there as a 7-year-old and watch aerialists do touchdowns, while you're eating your cold chicken drumstick was just, I mean, it's hard for people to understand today what the world was like then, but it was the end of the Depression, 1938. And there were no Technicolor movies, there were no Disneylands, there were no Marine lands, there was no television. Uh, it was a black and white world, basically, pretty drab. And and people didn't have the money and the flash that they live with today. Children didn't have the toys they have today. So those little treats were huge in my life. We all had to go to school on the set too. And I remember the teacher and and later on at Stanford, that teacher's daughter was one of my roommates. And she and I became really good friends. And Mrs. Carter's name was the teacher's name. And Diana always insisted that her mother was Judy Garland's teacher. But I said, no, she was our teacher.
Your life was not marked by the kind of discrimination and difficulties that a lot of the little people had. And yet I've read your book, and you dealt with racial discrimination because of your Hawaiian background. You have a great deal about religion and its impact on your life. Your home burned to the ground and you suffered all this injustice at the hands of insurance agents.
Yeah.
It seems to me that you have used your life, your experience with the CIA as a reporter, to try and make a difference in the lives of a lot of other people.
Well, it's connected with the title because my determination or my attitude toward life and overcoming what I consider obstacles in life is it's a good metaphor, the yellow brick road, because Dorothy and her friends met with all kinds of obstacles on their trip on the yellow brick road. And my life was not particularly easy because I was a brown-skinned girl who was raised as a white-skinned girl in a white world. I didn't know what it meant to be Hawaiian, and I didn't even know I was part Chinese. So we moved out to Berkeley in the mid 50s. I was in my 20s. And I thought, there are a lot of Hawaiians in this area. I'm going to find them and I'm going to find what it means to be Hawaiian. And I thought, I love to dance. So I'll do that through the hula. So I danced and became Hawaiian and I loved to dance. And then I got a wonderful job at Channel 2 and became a reporter, news reporter. And I loved that. And I was so busy. Then I had kids, too busy with family and my career that hula just ebbed away from my life. I didn't have time to do it. I didn't dance for 30 years until
you're back dancing now.
After I retired and I decompressed from the busyness of news, I decided I would treat myself to the hula again. And I got back into the hula and now it's the core of my life. I have a wonderful group of ladies who I teach the hula. We do shows all over the valley. My life is full of Hawaiian music and Hawaiian friends.
I did also want to ask before we close, both Steve Cox and Bob Baum contributed to your book. Yes. Can you tell us how you came to know them and involve them in the Munchkin Diary?
So there was a little article in the San Francisco Chronicle, which I happened to see. This guy, author, looking for anybody who'd been involved with the movies, especially it had been a Munchkin. So I said, "What? It's a Munchkin?" I called him up, and I said I was a Munchkin, and he asked me about 1,001 questions, because I think he expected a lot of people who claimed to be Munchkins who hadn't been. So when I told him my mother was still alive and she'd been at the set with me, he called her and checked on my story with what she said. And when he called me back and he said, well, your mom says the same thing about your experiences that you did. So he accepted the fact that I was telling the truth. The problem was there were no pictures, that my mother never took a picture of me during those 3 weeks on the set. In the 30s, people didn't, I mean, she took a couple pictures of my brother and me in Hollywood, but never at a show, never in any of the movies we were in. And we were in, several movies as children, mostly Hawaiian movies about the South Seas, but not one picture, not any visual proof that I had been on that set. So he just took my word for it and included me in his book. He found 30 of the Munchkins, but he and I became friends out of that, and we're still in touch. And Robert Baum, I met at one of the Oz conventions, when you've been to a million of them, right? I just went to one. Uh, After I retired from Channel 2, I had the time to do that. And I thought, well, I'm going to do this. So my husband and I went to the Oz convention in Chesterton, Indiana. I heard there were 95,000 Oz fans there that week.
What was Bob doing?
Well, he was there too as a celebrity. But we met, and then we started exchanging Christmas cards, just because he and Claire are just nice. And so we've had a Christmas card exchange ever since, well, 20 years or something like that, 30 years, I guess, long time. They were just so nice and gracious to do that, and I do appreciate it. But somebody asked, well, why did you call it the Munchkin Diary? And the answer is so I could talk about my personal yellow brick road, my trip of life. That's really what it is.
How do people buy your book? Maybe that
through Amazon. It's available at some local bookstores here in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I am also available for communication at my Hula website, which is Hulamai, that's Hulamai, Hulamai.org. And also a website we're still working on for the Munchkin. So I am the Munchkin at themunchkindiary.org.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate your time today and hope that we will be hearing more from you in the future.
Oh, it's really nice to meet you, Jane. I've heard so much about your organization, and I admire what you're doing, and that keeps you very busy. I know that. Because I still get a couple of fan mails asking for my autograph on things. Did you know that's out there? I got a letter a week or so ago it was the Ukraine. Oh no, it was from Hungary. A letter from Hungary. I mean, that film is so beloved by so many people all over the world. Frank Baum's legacy is going to live forever and ever. Well,
and you are a part of it.
I feel very, very blessed to be part of it. I do. Yeah. Thank you. Did you meet Craig?
Yeah, we sort of did.
Hi,
Jane. We have a few pictures, like she mentioned, of her back in those days.
I have one picture from with Judy Garland. Steve Cox found it when he was visiting Meinhardt Robbie one year, and it was just a few years ago. And he was looking through Meinhardt Robbie's personal scrapbook, and he looked at that picture and he said, I think that's Betty Ann. Can I have a copy of that picture? I'm going to send it and see if that is her. And so he sent it to me, and I just took one look at it. I said, yes, of course. He said, now I'm going to send you something. I want you to look at it very carefully and make sure, blah, blah. I said, yeah, it's me. I was so happy to get it.
Thank you, Betty. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you very much. It has been for me too. Yeah.
Brady Schwind, thank you for being with us today. I think of you as the champion of the Lost Art of Oz project, and now you're becoming the author of The Lost Art of Oz as a book. Can you tell us a little bit about that process, how you've come to be writing this book for us?
Well, I think what's interesting when it comes to the Oz art, I think it's the one area in Oz academia that's really not been explored. When we talk about the artwork created for Denslow, created by Denslow and by Neil and by Frank Kramer and Dick Martin and Dirk for the original series. That is something that's just not been explored. And what I found was there was a really interesting story there. And the story really is that most of this artwork that is a big part, I think, of what made the books iconic and that sparked the imagination for so many people. Most of this artwork is missing. And it's missing for different reasons, but it's mostly missing because at the time it was not valued as art. It was utilitarian art to draw illustrations in children's books. And this was before anybody had any idea that The Wizard of Oz was going to become what it has become. But it was also before the children's literature market was really solidified. The Oz books in this country are what changed not only the way children's books were made and certainly the way they were illustrated, but how they were marketed, and they created a market that really was not there before. So going back 100 years ago, no one really thought to keep this art and to preserve it. And so I guess I was one of the first people that thought, I'm going to go out there and really try to find out where this stuff has gone to the degree that I can, and to learn about not only the artist, but the people that have been the custodians of the art along the way is what I found to be just as interesting a story. It must be said, as magnificent as the Oz book illustrations are, if you've not seen what the original artwork looked like, you've not experienced them. Like any art, you've just not experienced it until you've seen what it looks like. So the goal of the book, of course, is partly to create a beautiful kind of coffee table type of book that will finally preserve for audiences this original artwork, and will hopefully be a long-awaited testament to some of these illustrators that have for 100 years deserved this. But again, it will be this interesting story about the search for the artwork, and as the Wizard of Oz reminds us, the people you meet along the journey are so interesting.
So are you finding this artwork in private collections, framed and hanging on walls, or are you somewhere in a storage unit with a flashlight looking into books?
A little bit of both. The artwork, which again, Riley and Lee really didn't retain. And so it got out for a bunch of different reasons, or by a bunch of different methods. I think certainly some of it was just not kept, and the organization moved a number of times. And I think they didn't always take the artwork with them. They didn't see the validity in holding on to 4,000 drawings when the books were all said and done. So some of it was thrown away, but some of it was also lent out at the time. This was a popular way to market the books, was to send out the illustrations, and they would put them in window displays or in bookstores, and that was a way to promote the books. And it was supposed to be returned, but oftentimes it wasn't. And then I think there were a lot of people that probably unofficially helped themselves to some of the stuff that was in the archive. And we know that the people that ran the company were generous with the artwork as well. So some of it I'm finding in collections that people have had for years, and some of it you're finding in storage drawers. My favorite recent story is a gentleman that reached out on my website who said, we've had this drawing for as long as I can remember. It's been in a drawer, and it's been something we've carted around house to house with the bits of string and tape and stuff you would have in a junk drawer. And my granddaughter thinks it looks a little bit Wizard of Oz like, is what she said. And he sent me an image, and it ended up being one of Denslow's original drawings for one of the color plates in The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. I mean, and to be still discovering something like that 120 years later is really exciting. And it kind of gives me hope that there's just more stuff out there that's waiting to be discovered. Part of this conversation is, too, it's honoring some of those early historians of Oz, like Dick Martin and some of the early Oz Club members, Irene Fisher, and some of those people that were the first to rescue it and to preserve it, and to try to make it available to other people to enjoy. So it's their journey too.
Wonderful story about the Denslow piece. Have you uncovered any truly lost Neil art that we did not realize had survived that might have a fun story to share?
I always say this is a process of discovery and rediscovery, because sometimes we know stuff existed, but then we haven't known where it's been for 50, 60 years. So then it's not it's not a sure thing that it still exists. One of my favorite things, and I think I saw you the day after I had gone to visit, was rediscovering what we call the Lufkin collection, which was Mrs. Lufkin was a wealthy New York socialite that commissioned John Arneal to do a number of Oz pieces, including a very large Oz mural. And she also had several color plate watercolors for Emerald City of Oz that John Arneal had done. That was kind of how she got interested in his art anyway. But we really didn't know what had happened to them. They kind of had fallen off the radar. And, now you're talking about the grandkids having the artwork. And I was able to track them down and to go and visit it. And it's wonderful to see. I would say that was one particularly neat cache of things that to rediscover. We thought it was out there, but we hadn't seen it in a long time.
Was it one of the Oz books dedicated to the Luftons?
It was interesting. So John Arneal had a really close relationship with the Lufkin family. And I think it partly came from the fact that he was a patron of theirs. I mean, they were patrons of his work, I should say. And this was in the early 30s when times were hard, and he had 3 college-age girls. And I think the commissions that she hired him to do, I think must have meant a great deal to him financially. And he gifted her a number of things, a number of artifacts, which are very interesting. And then he dedicated Wonder City of Oz to her. But some of the things that he even gave to the family, which I think, people would be intrigued by, or some of the original, when Neil would get a manuscript, a typed manuscript from, say, Ruth Plumley Thompson, he would begin just sketching on it right away, his ideas, and in pencil, right on the manuscript. And a lot of these drawings ended up pretty much transferring over into the book. And he gave Mrs. Lufkin a number of those manuscripts with his drawings all over them. And he even gave the Lufkin family his copy of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz that L. Frank Baum had given him in 1904 when he came on to illustrate his first Oz book, The Marvelous Land of Oz. So just a wonderful treasure trove there. And again, this is that the family didn't necessarily understand the significance of all of it, but they treasure it as a legacy piece for their grandmother at this point. So it's wonderful. It's wonderful sometimes to remind the heirs of their history. And stuff does continue to pop up. Some drawings popped up at auction a couple of years ago that were from The Scarecrow in Oz. And that's a book that previously no artwork was thought to survive. So I don't know. I mean, Jane, I hope always springs eternal. I'm waiting for the person to ring me up and come to my doorstep with the entire sleeve of Dorothy and the Wizard and Oz drawings. I think it could happen. One of the real mysteries really is like those, the merry-go-round drawings, because you know that Dick, if he had kept them, he was a collector of art himself. So it's strange that they are not accounted for. Either he turned them into the publisher and they didn't retain them, or I wouldn't be surprised if he gave them to someone, but we don't know who. It's not, the Hollisters have the pencil sketches, but that's not what would have been in the book.
You mentioned a website, and you also have a blog. Tell people how they can follow your stories.
Well, I have a website called The Lost Art of Oz. It's www.lostartofoz.com. And we do blogs, and of course, we're on social media as well. And they can learn about the project. And certainly if anyone has original artwork, I think that that's a big part of this journey too. Aside from the joy of going out there and finding it, there is a real academic point to this, which is to definitively catalog what exists, because it's important to know what exists and to kind of track and know where it is and where it's ended up. And no one has done that before either. So there might be people that are watching this that bought a drawing at an Oz convention in 1965, and we'd love to hear from you too, because it's just valuable for us to know, from a academic perspective, what exists.
Certainly. Do you have any kind of an estimated timeline at this point for when I might have this book in my hand or my copy?
Well, I have my this is like a little prototype that's just, it really is kind of something that was created to kind of shop around and show people what the idea could be. And we do have, I can't disclose the details yet, but we do have a publisher that is interested in it. And it would coincide with something else that they've got going on. So hopefully, as these things go, within the next couple of years, that's always how with the book. with a book deal and with the publishing thing, it's never next week. It's always by season. So, but I'm optimistic that it will be sooner than later.
Wonderful. Well, I am certainly glad that you have entered the realm of nonfiction Oz writers to bring this work together for us. As a collector myself, I really look forward to having it. And I know so many of the people who've had this artwork through the years that it's, almost it's visiting with friends for me to even think about them sharing their stories.
Absolutely. And I really do have to just thank you officially here and now for being so supportive and for really being the first person that was the guardian of the gates that began opening the doors for me and saying, you might reach out to this person, you might touch base with this person. And I think it's been fun too, because this has been a project that has kind of brought everyone together because everyone knows it's a good idea, knows it should be done. And it's truly coming from a place of love, a love of Oz and a love particularly for these artists that I think we all feel just have never quite been recognized the way that they deserve. And hopefully this will be one step of many to help keep their memory alive.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for being with us. Again, I just really look forward to reading the book, and I appreciate so much the work that you've done.
Thank you, Jane.
Lights, Camera, Witchcraft, A Critical History of Witches in American Film and Television is written by Heather Greene. Welcome, Heather.
Hello, Jane. I'm glad to be here.
I would like to start by having you tell me a little bit about what led to this book.
Okay, well, back when I was getting my master's degree, I started to notice that there was a trend in witchcraft films. There was a growing interest in them, and there was, like I said, a trend in movies. And this was, a good 20 years ago. But I, at that point, I was busy and didn't actually pursue the study. So I took it back up, and I'm glad I did. About 15 years later, I said, wait a minute, we've got another trend going on again. And this was only about 8 or 10 years ago. And so I watched that and observed that there was, again, an increase in witch films and I became interested in what that meant in terms of, culture, our culture here in the US, and why was there a sudden surge in witchcraft films again? So that's what led to the book.
We Wizard of Oz fans tend to feel like the 1939 classic MGM musical is just this milestone, benchmark, bar setter when it comes to witchcraft on film, witchiness in general. Do you find in your research that it was a significant factor?
Yes, absolutely. I'm sure that my love of that film is part of the reason that I started exploring witch movies, is part of the reason. And absolutely, without a doubt, as I said, The Wizard of Oz is probably, I would say, the most influential witch film on American culture. Without a doubt. It's specifically not just the whole film, but the Wicked Witch of the West first and then Glinda second. They are two of the most iconic witches that exist in our culture, recognizable across the board by almost every American. I would venture to guess everyone. And on top of that, there are aspects of that production that have just lasted for years and years, decades into today, that have just influence film and influence witch film specifically. The one piece that makes Oz so influential, although not the only piece, but the one piece, and it's fun, is that prior to 1939, no witches had green faces. Margaret Hamilton said that in an interview that the green paint was originally used to resolve a Technicolor problem. So the green paint was not something related to witchcraft. It was not related to witches. They needed to solve a Technicolor problem with regard to her skin tone and her costuming. They needed something different. So when they did their testing, her head looked like it was floating. Her skin tone against her black costume was problematic for the filming. So they had to resolve it. So either change the costume or change the skin color. They change the skin color. So from that point forward, beginning only a couple years later, witches across Hollywood and television begin to have green skin. So if you ask me again, like you asked earlier, did The Wizard of Oz have that much influence on other Hollywood films and witches? Absolutely. Green skin alone, that was all Oz. That was all the directors of photography, costumers, makeup artists of Oz that created what we consider now, an obvious definition of what it means to be a witch: green skin.
Have you found in your research previous appearances of good witches on film, or was Billie Burke the first?
She was not the first. That I get asked that question a lot. First of all, The Wizard of Oz from 1939 was not the first witch film. It was not the first Oz film. That was 1910, not even 10 years after the books were produced and released. So that there was a good witch. Glinda was in that one. She was called Glinda the Good. She was not called a witch, and she looked like a fairy, which is similar to the 39 version. But yes, there was that one. And then after that, witches, the way they were presented prior to 1939 was not exactly the same as they were after in the 30s and then beyond, especially with The Wizard of Oz and Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, particularly. Prior to that, witches were not necessarily good or bad. They were sort of amoral. And so there were some good ones that would help the heroine in various films. And then there were some bad ones, but none of them were terribly, terribly evil or terribly, terribly good like we find in The Wizard of Oz.
In the blurbs that I've read about your book, I haven't been able to read the book yet because it's not yet released, but there are several references to The Craft. And it happens that Fairuza Balk, who starred in The Craft, was Dorothy in Disney's Return to Oz, which had another extraordinary witch, Mombi, based on Baum's Langwidere character. I wondered if you worked her into your book at all.
Mombi, I don't talk about her in relation to that film because I don't get into that version. The book covers more than just Oz films, and there are thousands of films. So I do mention that particular film. And yes, the star of that is Dorothy, does then star in The Craft. You're exactly right. And but I do mention the character of Mombi just mention her in relation to other Oz films, like particularly the early ones in the silent era. I use her name then. I mentioned that she does exist in a late 60s one. And then you know what, I don't know if I mention her again. I do mention that she is a character, but she's never, Mombi, and the naming of the Wicked Witch in Oz films is doesn't necessarily happen all the time. So it's not a name that's known. Nobody knows. In fact, I think Elphaba is actually probably more well known as her name now currently than Mombi ever was.
Absolutely. In fact, I wondered, when Wicked is made into a film, are you going to have to revise the book?
Right. I actually mentioned Wicked just briefly as that it exists. I believe I just heard that it's going to start filming next year. And it's a fantastic musical. I'm a big Broadway fan, so I was so thrilled when they decided to do Oz or an Oz adjacent, Broadway show. It's fantastic, and I'm looking forward to the film.
That musical kind of switched gears and puts Elphaba, the Wicked Witch, in the Good Witch role. I grew up in the 60s, so my understanding of Good Witches was watching Bewitched and Mary Poppins, and it was sort of a common thing to have these benevolent, lovely, magical women that drift down and solve problems.
The nanny as a witch that's a Hollywood trope, and you get that all the time. They're either fairies or good witches are typically designed to be fairies or angelic or nannies, mothers. So I think the good fairies in Sleeping Beauty are wonderful. And of course, Bedknobs and Broomsticks, she actually is a witch. Angela Lansbury, was one of my childhood favorites. And I love Mary Poppins. Who doesn't love Mary Poppins, right? Although she's not technically a witch, she's the magical nanny. It's close. after 1939, most of the derivatives and most of the adaptations of The Wizard of Oz were of the movie. They were influenced predominantly by the movie and less so by the book itself. And The Wiz is one of the few that actually derives its structure from the original books. And that's mainly because there's 4 witches, rather than most others have only the 2. And maybe a dead one, but like The Wizard of Oz. But in The Wiz seems to try to capture the essence of the original book rather than defining its world strictly by The Wizard of Oz, 1939. So that's an interesting aspect of The Wiz. And plus, the music is fantastic.
Well, and you get to hear Lena Horne sing.
Yeah. Now, the movie itself did not do well. And Lena Horne was fantastic, as were some of the other actors. But the movie was a little overdone and it did not do very well. But the Broadway show was, it was award winning.
It sounds like we can expect The Wizard of Oz to maybe weave its way through your book, as opposed to just being the Oz chapter.
That's exactly right. My book is a walk through history. It's a walk through Hollywood's history, American history, the history of gender politics with regards to women and power. So there's a lot of threads that are going through this, and that's what turned out to make Oz such a powerful influencer, because it never goes away. And I talk about Oz in almost every chapter, because there is, I would say, maybe 3 chapters where Oz disappears completely, and that's from 1939 until the 1960s. There's a period of time where there was very little Oz stuff, and that's because Oz was considered box office poison for a long time, and it really was television that brought it back to the forefront. And then you have, from that point, as television starts to bring it back into prominence and popularity, you start to get more and more, and it dots the landscape. And so in almost every chapter after 1960, I say something about either about Oz and the derivatives and all the derivatives. And like I said, I don't get into a lot of detail with every one, but I do talk about a few of them. I mention them as they show up, and I also mention how Oz influences things. There's more about, in the later chapters, more about how Oz is influencing other stuff, other productions. Absolutely. There's almost no chapter where I don't talk about something about Oz, because that's how influential it is. Whether I like the movie or not, I have a section on The Wiz because I love The Wiz. And then, I talk about Oz the Great and Powerful, which I think was terrible, various things like that. So it comes up throughout. So I think people will really enjoy seeing other movies, but then also seeing how their beloved has, like it is true. It is true. So I think you guys will enjoy it.
Well, so now that you all have us all chomping at the bit to get your book, when does it become available and where do we find it?
It will be on every, website that sells books, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, wherever, and also Llewellyn.com, my publisher, they will have it available there. It's going to be out in October, just in time for the Halloween fun. So when you're watching your Wizard of Oz this October around Halloween, which is what I used to do as a child, you can also read about it.
I look forward to finding other surprises in your book about the history of witchcraft on film and in television, and how the Wizard of Oz has influenced it. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you very much for having me. I love talking about the Wizard of Oz and witches on film and all things magic and film. So thank you again.
Now we welcome Dina Massachi. Dina is with the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, where she teaches, among other things, a Wizard of Oz class. Many of you will know her from her writing. She's written considerably for the Bomb Bugle, as well as other publications that we'll be talking about shortly. And she appeared on the American Experience documentary on the PBS channel about L. Frank Baum, talking about our favorite author. And Dina is rapidly becoming a favorite author herself. Dina, if you'd start by telling me how a person even becomes a nonfiction writer, because your experience is a little different than what some of the other people on our panel today have been through.
Well, thank you, Jane. And that was such a sweet introduction. So I kind of took a slightly non-traditional route toward getting published. And that's to say, I wrote a paper when I was in graduate school, and everyone got very excited about that paper. And I was looking for a home for that paper. And that one I followed a little more traditionally. So I looked at different journals I might submit it to. And each journal has its own formatting and its own submission process. And actually, the first journal turned it down. And then I submitted it to a different journal, and they did the very well-known revise and resubmit, which is kind of what I've come to expect from peer review journals, which means they send you back a whole bunch of edits, and if you make them, then they will accept, presumably, your paper. So I did, and while I was doing that, I was playing around with some other things. At that point, I was already teaching for UNC Charlotte, and one of my coworkers offered me the chance to review the Wizard of Oz, the Andrew Lloyd Webber Wizard of Oz musical that was coming through Charlotte at 10 cents a word. So I was very excited and trying to come up with as many words as possible to describe it. And my mentor at the university, Mark West, read the little 1,000 words I ended up submitting, and he really liked it. And he comes by my office one day and he goes, "This is opportunity knocking." And he offered me a chapter in an upcoming essay collection he had. So at that point, I had been published in an online journal. I was hoping to be published in this peer-reviewed journal that was the Journal of American Culture. They did accept it. I was published there. And then I had a chapter for Mark West and Kathy Jackson's Shapers of American Childhood. And PBS found me through that chapter. So I find one thing usually leads to another, but it's getting that first thing out there that is just the hardest.
I just happen to have Shapers of American Childhood right here next to my computer. The book that you're here to talk with us about today, however, is not yet in my hot little hands. Could you tell us a bit about your chapter about the Land of Oz in Vanderbilt, North Carolina?
Absolutely. So Mark and Kathy, they do a lot of these collections where everybody writes a chapter and it becomes its own unique thing. And the one that they have coming up is called Childhood Narratives and the Places They Inspire. And it should be published by the end of this year. It certainly is going to be in McFarland's spring catalog. But publishing is just the slowest thing in the whole world. The Bomb Bugle, you guys don't even know how lucky we are with how quickly Sarah gets things turned around, because that is just not how most of the things I write for get done. And so in about, gosh, it must have been 2017-ish, Mark West let me know that I'm going to do another collection and would I be interested? And he thought the Land of Oz Park in North Carolina would be perfect. And I had never even really heard of the Land of Oz theme park other than Googling around, and everything on the web says it's this horrible, abandoned, decrepit place where people steal bricks and it's creepy. And that is not at all what it is. If you've ever been there, there's nothing better than putting your feet on those yellow bricks. It's just amazing. And I contacted Sean Barrett, who I didn't know at the time. Now I am lucky enough to call him a friend and just a lovely human. And he opened up every resource he had possible to me. They were sold out of tickets that year. It was 2018. And he snuck me an extra ticket. Don't tell anybody that, because surely they'll think he'll do it for everybody. I was very, very lucky. Thank you, Sean. I'm so sorry. And I got to go to the park and I got to interview people afterwards, because everybody's really good about staying in character. So, you know, the Tin Man was not going to break character to tell me about his experience playing the Tin Man. And everyone was absolutely lovely. I would visit all the time if I could. And I've been back since and plan on going back again. And it was fascinating to really dive into the history of the park, because so much of what you read is based around the myth. It's sort of like the Hanging Munchkin or Pink Floyd and Dark Side of the Rainbow. Oz seems to be trenched in all of these weird myths that aren't based in anything remotely close to fact. And the Land of Oz theme park is just like that. So it was a lot of fun untangling the fiction from the fact.
Were you able to speak with people who were involved in the park back in the 70s when it was vibrant?
I was, to degrees. I mean, it depends who they were and how involved they still are. But yes, I got to talk to one of the original Tin Men who still works at the park, and his wife was an original Dorothy, and she still works at the park. And they have a daughter who now works at the park. So it's very neat. The Land of Oz is unique in that once you're there, you don't really seem to leave. The people who have been there forever seem to really stay attached. So that was a lot of fun.
I'm glad you'll get to be part of that history now.
I hope so. That would also be great.
Do we know when that book will materialize?
Sometime at the end of this year. It's really up to the publisher. The strangest thing about writing is you put in all this time and effort and energy, and at the end, it doesn't even belong to you. In fact, one of the best stories I've ever heard. So when you submit to a peer-reviewed journal, it's a blind submission. They remove your name from it. The reviewers don't know who wrote it. And so Mark West, my mentor at the university, he's actually one of the leading experts in Roald Dahl. He is like the Michael Patrick Hearn of Roald Dahl. And so he submitted something, and it was a blind submission, and it was rejected because he didn't quote Mark West enough.
Wonderful story. Well, I really appreciate you spending time with us today. We have 5 different nonfiction writers involved in this particular program, and each of you brings something different and unique to the table. I really appreciate your time.
Thanks so much, Jane.
I've asked Atticus Gannaway to be with us today. He is currently writing a book about Oz publishers, and I'd like to have him talk to us about that. You might start, however, by telling us how you came from being an Oz fiction writer to being a nonfiction writer.
Well, I had a lengthy fiction career starting at the age of 11. I just, have sort of a investigator's kind of curiosity. When I was editor-in-chief of the Bone Bugle for 4 years, between 2001 and 2004, and I became more steeped in the research side in a more formal way than I had been. I mean, I'd always read the reference books about Baum and Oz and whatnot, and those were interesting to me. But I had not been actively engaged with that kind of research, I think, until I was editing the journal, which then obviously I was doing that kind of thing. And it just kind of moving down that path, I think. And there's always, I remember when Fred Meyer would send out those lists of what people wanted in the Bugle as research topics. I knew from those that there was certainly an infinite number of topics one could take up. Started to wonder about Frank Kramer, who illustrated 2 of Jack Snow's 2 Oz books in the 1940s, The Magical Mimics in Oz and The Shaggy Man of Oz. And he was a complete cipher, basically. Out of the 11 authors and illustrators of the original books, he was the only one that really was a blank slate. And so I was living in New York by then, and he had lived his whole life in New York. So I thought, well, I have all the archives here that would have any bearing on his life, I would think. So I just decided to find out what I could about him. And then 3 years later, there's basically an entire bugle full of that research. At the time, edited by Scott Cummings. I had stepped down at that point. I was also always curious about Dick Martin, who I had corresponded with. He was a very private individual, and as involved as he was with the early club and with Riley and Lee and all these different facets of Oz, as a person, he was kind of murky, and I was curious about him. So the third branch that I was looking at basically at the same time, I would say back in 2007, 2008, was the aspect of the publishers. And that is what has taken the longest. I ended up doing a major article about Dick Martin in Bugle in 2013. So the Frank Kramer came to fruition, Dick Martin came to fruition, but the publishers, that's a much more involved thing. So the story behind the publication of the books, which is the kind of thing that interests me, publishing history. And books that just come out of nowhere. And we know about Baum's creative process, but I became curious about these people who sort of intersected with that and helped him bring that to the wider world, which is how we have Oz at all. So and their names are actually on the spines of the books. I mean, you have George M. Hill here. This may be blurry. Who published The Wonderful Wizard of Oz in 1900 and then went bankrupt. And I was curious why that happened, when he had this huge hit on his hands. Then two of his employees, his head salesman, Sumner Britton, and his production manager, Frank Riley, when George M. Hill went belly up, they started their own publishing company, Riley and Britton, which later changed to Riley and Lee after Britton left the firm, and William F. Lee became a vice president. I had collected first editions from an early age, and those names were always kind of there on the spines of the books that I loved so much, and I thought I would see what I could find out about them and famous last words. So I'm still working on that. They're rather obscure in the grand scheme of things. Riley and Britton / Riley and Lee was a smaller Midwest publisher, and their big hit was the Oz books and the poetry of Edgar Guest. But Baum went with Riley and Britton for a very particular reason, because they would devote all their attention to him, basically.
Was there a particular mystery or story or rumor that you had heard about any of the publishers that might have spurred you on to the kind of research that this book has required of you?
A couple of things along those lines. I wanted to understand more fully how George M. Hill would go bankrupt when he published the Father Goose, his book, the best-selling juvenile book of 1899, followed by The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, the best-selling children's book of the following year. So, and that involved going through the bankruptcy records and the trade press at the time, and delving into that, which is not exactly beach reading, but I took one for the team. So if you want to just see the synopsis, I'll have one for you. Another thing was, sadly, Frank Riley killed himself during the height of the Depression, and there was an anecdote I'd heard about what his suicide note actually said. So I was trying to track down that information, and that took a very long time. One of the first things I tried to do was to track down descendants of each of these 4 publishers. And I actually was able to do that. Not everyone had children, so it was not such a direct descent from the man to, great grandchildren or whatever. It would be a great nephew or what have you. And in Riley's case, it was a great nephew. And it was a relationship by email that I cultivated over the course of 5 years. I think he had a certain reluctance about opening up family history to a complete stranger, and I completely understand that. But it was a sort of back and forth over time, and I would share what information I had, and he would share a little bit, and then ultimately we did meet in person on several occasions, and he's just out in New Jersey, so I could very easily get to him. It just was a 5-year process. And so he had, Riley's last letters that he wrote the day he died, and actually really interestingly, and it's the kind of thing you hope to find, but you have no idea if it will exist still. The condolence letters, from Maud Baum, Ruth Polly Thompson, William F. Lee's widow, of Riley and Lee. And I mean, nobody's ever seen these. And there were a huge number of photographs. One of them, the circumstances of his death, which are sad. But it helped elucidate a little bit more of what was going on there.
You've mentioned publishers' records, bankruptcy records in the case of George Hill, and now family history and letters. Are there other types of material that someone doing the kind of research you're doing looks for in order to put together a book like this? I
treated it like I'm doing my own genealogy, except it's a different family that I'm not related to, as far as I know. So, I started with Ancestry.com, really, which is where I did a lot of these things. You piece things together through census records and birth and death records. I have a online site where I can construct family trees, and that's very helpful. Site. I mean,
do you at this point have an expectation for when you will be sufficiently finished to think that we can start looking for a published book?
And I do have, I think, a critical mass of the research that I need to do that. I couldn't have said that, at a certain point, but I know the perfect is the enemy of the good, and that's always the thing, that you can always find something else, but then you'll never finish. You'll never have everything. That's sort of the frustration of it, but it also kind of, it's a bit of a carrot dangling in front of you, and you keep going.
So perhaps another year plus-ish to actually write the book, the research is done. Do you have a publisher lined up, or will you start looking for one after the manuscript is finished? I don't know what that process is like.
I have gotten helpful feedback on my initial book proposal. I did put one together at one point, and got some feedback about how I could have a more sort of commercial angle to this. Not to be cynical, but there are things that compel people to read a book. I mean, there are things that are interesting to us that may not be so absorbing to the average person. And one thing I've certainly absorbed from the feedback I've gotten is that there really should be a focus at all times on Oz at the core of everything. And so, as interested as I am in these biographies that I've had to really work hard to uncover, the importance of those people and what they did and what their lives were is in how they intersected with Oz. And at this point, I see the protagonist of the book as less the publishers or L. Frank Baum than the Oz series itself, and just how it was that these people were able to turn it into this cultural phenomenon.
As an Oz collector, I'm always interested in the ephemera, the marketing pieces they did, the Ozmite Club, the maps, things that the publishers did to make the Oz books more appealing at the time, but that have left ephemera for people like you and I to collect today. Will that sort of material be addressed in your book?
Oh, certainly. I mean, the marketing is a huge part of it. And, like I said, the through line is how these people were able to make Oz successful. Yeah, the marketing, I mean, there's so many great pieces that I've run across, and so many interesting non-Oz publications from the publisher. That have sort of expanded my bookshelves there. It's a little dangerous.
Well, I appreciate the fact that you are one who is writing and adding to my shelves, be it The Silver Sorceress or your forthcoming book about Oz publishers, and appreciated your years with the Baum Bugle as well, of course.
Well, thank you so much. Yeah, no, it's been a nice journey.
And we'll look forward to your book when it's available.
Thank you so much.